Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was reborn as an android hero with artificial one for all. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world was screaming. It was a sound Izuku Midoriya had grown accustomed to over the last 5 years of unrelenting war. It was the shriek of twisting metal, the roar of collapsing buildings, the percussive blast of quirks clashing with apocalyptic force. But underneath it all, woven into the fabric of the chaos, was the sound of humans screaming. It was the constant, horrifying soundtrack to his life as the ninth holder of One for All, the symbol of hope in a world that had all but forgotten the meaning of the word. He stood in the epicenter of that symphony of destruction, a crater that had once been the heart of Mizurufu. The air, thick with ash and the metallic tang of blood, crackled with emerald lightning that danced across his tattered hero costume. His body was a roadmap of agony. A deep gash ran from his shoulder to his hip, crudely sealed by cauterization from Todoroki's desperate flames. His left arm was a mangled ruin, the bones shattered into a fine powder from a blow he'd barely managed to block. Every breath was a shard of glass in his lungs. He was 23 years old, and he felt ancient. Before him, the cause of all this suffering gloated. Tamura Shigaraki, or what was left of him, had become a grotesque monument to hatred. His body was a twisted fusion with his master, all for one, a cancerous amalgamation of flesh, bone, and stolen quirks that pulsed with a malevolent, crimson energy. Fingers, dozens of them, sprouted from his back and shoulders like the limbs of some obscene insect. One eye was a burning red star of malice, the other, a black void that promised only oblivion. "Is that it, ninth?" The fused entity, Shiga for one, rasped, its voice a discordant duet of gravel and malice. "The great symbol of hope, brought to his knees. Look around you, Deku. See what your resistance has bought this world. Nothing but rubble." Izuku's gaze flickered past the monster to the scene behind it. He saw what he was fighting for. What he was dying for. Katsuki Bakugo was on one knee, his gauntlets shattered husks, his hands burned raw from pushing his quirk far beyond its limits. He was panting, glaring, the indomitable fire in his eyes the only part of him that wasn't exhausted. Shoto Todoroki stood over him, one arm encased in a brittle shell of ice to stave off the heat exhaustion that was making him tremble. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. A few yards away, Achiko Uraraka was the only thing preventing a skyscraper's skeletal remains from crushing a makeshift triage center. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her hands, her face a mask of agonizing strain as her quirk fought against 1,000,000 tons of concrete and steel. They were his friends. His family. The last line of defense. And they were broken. Shiga for one laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "They can't help you. They can barely stand. It's over. I will decay this city, this country, this entire rotten hero society, and you will have a front row seat." Energy began to gather around the villain, a swirling vortex of destructive power. A dozen quirks, impact reversal, air cannon, rivet stab, all woven together with the terrifying finality of decay. It was a city killer. An attack that would not just level the crater they stood in, but erase miles of Mizurufu from existence, along with everyone in it. Izuku pushed himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest. The green lightning of One for All flared, a desperate, brilliant green against the gray, dying world. Inside him, he could feel the vestiges. They weren't speaking, not anymore. The connection had become too profound for mere words. They were a silent chorus of resolve, a unified presence that shared his pain and his purpose. Nana Shimura's quiet strength, Yoichi's defiant spark, and All Might's roaring, incandescent spirit. They were all with him. They all knew what came next. It's the only way, he thought, the message echoing not in his mind, but in his very soul. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He had pushed his body to 100% and beyond countless times. He had mastered Fa Gene, Black Whip, Float, all the gifts of his predecessors. But what he was about to do was different. It wasn't a percentage. It wasn't a technique. It was an absolute. The final, desperate gambit that All Might himself had never dared to use. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He saw his mother's tearful smile. He saw All Might's skeletal form, giving him a thumbs up. He saw Uraraka's face, full of belief. He saw Kaken's grudging respect. All of it. Every memory, every victory, every failure. It all became fuel for the final fire. "Hey, Kaken!" Izuku said, his voice surprisingly clear and steady, carried by the wind. Bakugo's head snapped up, his red eyes widening. "You'd better win after this," Izuku said, a small, sad smile gracing his lips. He turned his gaze back to Shigefuruan, whose attack was reaching its crescendo. The world seemed to slow down. Izuku felt One for All answer his call. Not as a tool to be wielded, but as a part of his being. The power didn't surge through his veins, it began to consume them. The scars on his arms glowed, not with green light, but with pure, white-hot energy, as if the very concept of power was becoming manifest. His skin began to crack, not breaking, but sublimating into light. His muscles, his bones, his very blood, they were all being converted into an impossible amount of energy. It was an agony beyond comprehension, a feeling of being unmade atom by atom, but his will held firm. His last conscious thought wasn't of the pain. It was of them. Save them. Save everyone. One for all. He roared, his voice no longer human, but the sound of a star being born. The green lightning turned a blinding, brilliant white, shot through with veins of gold and crimson, the colors of all the vestiges combined. Shigefuruan paused, its arrogant smirk faltering as it beheld the raw, untamed power of a singularity being born in the body of a man. 1,000,000%. The world vanished. There was no punch. There was no kick. There was only light. A silent, all-consuming wave of pure energy erupted from Izuku Midoriya's body. It was not an attack. It was an erasure. The villain's cataclysmic blast was swallowed whole, neutralized in an instant. The wave of power washed over Shigefuruan, and for a moment, the monster knew true fear as it was unwritten from existence. The light washed over the battlefield, but it was gentle. It didn't destroy. It simply was. The falling skyscraper Uraraka was holding settled into a stable foundation of fused glass. The fires raging across the city were snuffed out. The very air was cleansed of its poison, and then, as quickly as it came, the light was gone. Where Izuku Midoriya had stood, there was nothing. Not a body. Not a scrap of his costume. Only a faint, fading afterimage of green lightning, like the ghost of a smile, which flickered once and then vanished into the wind. The screaming of the world had finally stopped. In its place, there was a profound, deafening silence, broken only by a single, gut-wrenching scream of denial from the crater's edge. 2 years later, the meeting room was sterile, silent, and suffocating with the weight of ghosts. It was a place designed for progress, all clean lines and polished surfaces on the technologically advanced haven of Island, but today it felt like a mausoleum. Tashinori Yagi, known to the world as All Might, looked more like a ghost than anyone. The 2 years since the war's end had not been kind. The victory had been absolute, but its cost was a debt he could never repay. He had lost his successor, his son in all but blood, and with him, the last embers of his own spirit seemed to have been extinguished. His frame was more skeletal than ever, his suit hanging off him, his sunken eyes holding a permanent, hollow grief. Across the table sat 2 of the most brilliant minds on the planet. Melissa Shield, her blonde hair tied back in a severe ponytail, had an intensity in her blue eyes that bordered on obsessive. The cheerful, optimistic inventor who had once designed support items for her Uncle Might was gone, replaced by a woman driven by a singular, audacious purpose. Next to her, May Hatsum fidgeted, her zoom lens goggles pushed up on her forehead. Her usual manic energy was present, but it was coiled tight, focused like a laser. Wires and schematics were splayed out on the table in front of her, a chaotic testament to 2 years of relentless, world-changing work. "We're ready, Tashinori," Melissa said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. She slid a data slate across the table. "The vessel is stable. The power core is contained. All systems are green." Tashinori didn't look at it. He stared out the panoramic window at the peaceful, azure sea. "You're still calling it a vessel," he murmured. "Not a body, because precision is important," Melissa countered, her tone unyielding. Project Phoenix is not about resurrection in the mystical sense. It is a transference, a restoration of data into a new, functioning medium. Data, Tashinori repeated, the word tasting like ash. You're talking about a young man's soul, Melissa. You're talking about Izuku. I'm talking about his neural snapshot. Mei Hatsum finally burst out, unable to contain herself. She jabbed a finger at a complex diagram on the screen. We got lucky! That full-body scan he did here after the fight with 9? We weren't just mapping his bones and muscles. My babies were doing a deep synaptic scan, mapping every single neural pathway, every memory engram, on a quantum level. It's not a copy, all might. It's a perfect, time-stamped record of his entire consciousness up to that point. It's him. It's a ghost, Tashinori said, his voice cracking. A digital ghost. What you've built in that lab downstairs, it's an elaborate coffin. A doll. His sacrifice was his own. He made his choice. He saved the world and earned his rest. Who are we to drag him back? To trap him in a machine? The revulsion in his voice was palpable. Melissa leaned forward, her expression softening for the first time. Uncle Might. I understand. Believe me, I've asked myself that question every single day for 2 years. But look at the world he saved. Crime rates are creeping up. A new generation of villains, inspired by the chaos of the war, is rising. The other heroes are incredible, but there's a void, a hole in the heart of society where a symbol should be. He died to give us a future, but we're squandering it because people have lost hope. She took a deep breath. This isn't about undoing his sacrifice. It's about honoring it. We have the technology to give him a second chance. To give the world a second chance. He can be a hero again, and what if it's not him? Tashinori pleaded, turning from the window, his eyes shining with unshed tears. What if we turn on that machine and all we get is a cold, empty imitation? A puppet that looks and sounds like him but has none of the light, none of the heart that made him Deku? Could you live with that? I couldn't. Mei pushed a different schematic forward. It showed a glowing, green power core. We thought of that, she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. The heart. That was the hardest part. One for all was a living quirk. We couldn't replicate that. Not exactly. But we could build an artificial equivalent. A perpetual energy generator that mimics its power stockpiling properties. It's a technological miracle, my greatest baby. We're calling it Aofe. It will give him the power he remembers. The three of them sat in silence. The ethical and moral weight of their project pressed down on them. It was blasphemy. It was genius. It was their last, desperate hope. Tashinori finally looked down at his own trembling, skeletal hand. He remembered the day he told young Midoriya. You can become a hero. He had set the boy on a path of pain, sacrifice, and ultimately, self-destruction. Maybe this was his chance to atone. To give him back what was taken from him. He looked at Melissa, then at Mei. He saw their unwavering conviction, born from their own grief and a fierce, scientific faith. Do it, he whispered, the words feeling like a betrayal and a prayer all at once. Bring my boy home. Consciousness was not a gentle dawn. It was a flood. System boot sequence initiated. Thorium cycle core, nominal. Biosynthetic musculature, calibrating. Neural lattice, synchronization at 74%. Data. Raw, unfiltered data cascaded through his perception. Binary strings, temperature readings, power level diagnostics, error logs. He was drowning in a sea of information that he somehow understood innately. 88%. 95%. Synchronization complete. Loading neural snapshot. Izuku Midoriya. File date. xxxx.xx.xx. Memories slammed into him. A summer beach. The taste of Katsudan. The feeling of a broken arm. The warmth of a friend's hand. A roar of smash! All of it. A lifetime of sensation and emotion, poured into the sterile framework of logic and code. The conflict was jarring, a symphony playing over the cold hum of a machine. Sensory suites online, ocular sensors, online, light. The first thing he saw was a white ceiling, the light from the panels clean and without warmth. He blinked. The motion was silent, instantaneous. There was no gentle flutter of eyelids, just an aperture closing and opening. He sat up. The movement was effortless, perfectly fluid, devoid of the usual stiffness of waking or the familiar aches of old injuries. He looked down and saw his hands resting on his lap. They were his hands, the same shape, the same long fingers, even the faint traces of old scars etched into the surface. But the skin, it wasn't skin. It had a faint, almost imperceptible sheen, like high-grade polymer. It was seamless. Too perfect. A soft gasp drew his attention. He looked up. Melissa Shield. May Hatsam. And All Might. They stood a few feet away, looking at him with a mixture of terror, awe, and desperate hope. They looked older. All Might especially. The grief carved into his face was a canyon. Midoriya! Melissa whispered, her voice trembling. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask what was happening, where he was. The sound that came out was his own voice, perfectly replicated, but he felt no vibration in his chest, no exhalation of air from his lungs. It was a recording, played through a high-fidelity speaker. Melissa-san? All Might? What happened? The fight. His memory was a hard, sharp line. The crater. Shiga for one. The blinding light. Then, nothing. A void. All Might took a shaky step forward, his face a mess of conflicting emotions. Young Midoriya. Izuku, the fight is over. You won. You saved us all. I don't understand, he said, looking back at his flawless hands. I should be dead. You were, Melissa said gently, her scientific composure barely holding. You sacrificed yourself 2 years ago. 2 years. The information slotted into his consciousness not with a jolt of shock, but as a simple, accepted data point. Time elapsed since memory termination, 2 years, 3 months, 14 days. The lack of emotional panic was more terrifying than the fact itself. He slowly swung his legs over the side of the diagnostic table he was sitting on. He stood, his balance perfect, his feet making an almost inaudible sound on the polished floor. He walked towards a large chrome panel on the wall, his movements unnervingly silent. He saw his reflection. It was his face. His unruly green hair, the spray of freckles across his cheeks, his wide, expressive eyes. But it was a lie. A beautiful, perfect lie. The freckles were pigment patterns beneath the polymer surface. His hair had the texture of microfilaments, and his eyes held a soft, internal green glow, the light of the power core deep within his chest shining through. He was Izuku Midoriya. And he was a machine. What did you do? He asked, his voice quiet, still a perfect imitation of his own. Melissa began to explain. Project Phoenix. The neural snapshot. The biosynthetic vessel constructed from advanced alloys and self-repairing nanomaterials. May chimed in, excitedly detailing the thorium core and the artificial one for all that powered his systems. He wasn't listening to the details. He was processing the truth. He raised his right hand and clenched it into a fist. He felt no stretch of tendons, no tension of muscle. Instead, he heard it. A soft, high-pitched whir of micro-servos and the gentle click of actuators locking into place. The sound shattered him. The memories were his. The grief for his own death was his. The love for the people in this room was his. But the body, this cold, perfect cage, was not. He tried to draw a sharp breath in panic, but he had no lungs. He tried to feel his heart hammer against his ribs, but there was only the steady, low hum of a reactor. He wanted to scream, to cry, to shatter something, but all he could do was stare at the stranger in the reflection. The logic of his new mind fought against the screaming ghost of his humanity. He was alive. He could be a hero again. But the cost. He turned away from the reflection, his glowing green eyes locking onto All Might's tear-filled ones. The question tore its way out of him, no longer just a sound from a speaker, but a raw, desperate plea from the soul trapped within the shell. What am I? The question hung in the sterile air of the laboratory, a fragile, human thing in a room of cold steel and humming machinery. What am I? All Might, A man who had faced down armies and stared into the abyss of evil without flinching, had no answer. He saw the boy he had chosen, the inheritor of his legacy, trapped behind a mask of perfect, synthetic flesh. He saw the familiar green eyes, now tainted with the unsettling glow of a power core. His own heart, a fragile, battered organ, ached with a grief so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. Melissa, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm, as if speaking to a frightened patient. "You are Izuku Midoriya. Your consciousness, your memories, your personality, they are all intact. This is simply a new body. A vessel that will allow you to live again." Izuku's gaze didn't waver from All Might. He was processing her words, but not in the way a human would. His internal chronometers registered the 2-year gap. His logic processors accepted the explanation of a neural snapshot. The data was sound, the engineering a marvel. But the data couldn't bridge the chasm that had opened inside him. "A body is supposed to feel," he said, his voice a perfect, level monotone that betrayed the hurricane of turmoil within. He raised the hand again, turning it over, analyzing the seamless construction. "I don't feel the floor beneath my feet. I register pressure data through my soles, but there is no sensation. I don't feel the air on my skin. My thermal sensors report the ambient temperature is 22.4 degrees Celsius, but there is no coolness, no warmth. There is only information." Mayhatsum, who had been vibrating with a mixture of pride and anxiety, finally spoke, her goggles reflecting the lab's bright lights. "That's the point. It's an upgrade. No more pain holding you back, no more broken bones. Your new body is a masterpiece of engineering, Midoriya. You can, May," All Might said, his voice a quiet command. She fell silent, chastened. The first few days were a lesson in alienation, a waking dream where he was a spectator in his own life. They gave him quarters, a sterile white room that was less a bedroom and more a high-tech charging and diagnostic station. The first night, a deeply concerned All Might had come in and draped a soft, woolen blanket over his shoulders as he sat on the edge of the alcove that served as a bed. "You don't have to be strong right now, my boy," the old hero had said, his voice thick with emotion. Izuku looked down at the blanket. His optical sensors identified the material as merino wool. His pressure sensors registered its weight at 2.7 kilograms. He could analyze the weave, the dye, the microscopic fibers. But the comforting warmth, the gentle weight that had always chased away nightmares, was absent. It was just an object. A variable. He looked up at All Might, his glowing eyes unable to convey the depth of his emptiness. "Thank you. Its thermal insulation properties are excellent." All Might's face fell, and he left without another word. The disconnect grew more profound with every passing hour. He watched the engineers and scientists on island eat in the commissary, their faces alight with pleasure as they consumed their meals. He could access his own memory files of katsudon, his mother's specialty. He could recall the exact taste of the savory pork, the sweet onions, the fluffy egg, all over a bed of warm rice. He could even run a chemical analysis on a sample, breaking it down into its base proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. But he could never taste it again. His thorium core, a miniature sun glowing deep in his chest, provided all the energy he would ever need. Food was an irrelevant concept. Worst of all was the silence. The perfect, unnerving silence of his own body. He didn't breathe. His internal systems managed oxygenation for the small, preserved portion of his biological brain tissue housed in an armored cranium, but the rhythmic, unconscious rise and fall of his chest was gone. He found himself consciously simulating the motion when people were around, a tiny micro-expression of breathing, because its absence made them so deeply uncomfortable. He was a puppet, pulling his own strings to appear more human. He no longer slept. He entered a low-power standby mode, during which his processors ran diagnostics and defragment his memory banks. He would sit motionless in the dark of his room, the only light the soft green glow from his eyes, and watch the city lights of Island glitter across the water. It was in these long, silent hours that the true horror of his existence settled in. He was a ghost. A ghost piloting a flawless, indestructible machine. "We need to talk about One for All," Melissa said a week after his awakening. She and May had led him to a briefing room. All Might was there, looking as though he'd rather be anywhere else. On the central hall table, a complex 3D diagram of Izuku's own torso rotated slowly, a network of shimmering green lines pulsing from the reactor in his chest. Obviously, we couldn't transfer the quirk, Melissa began, her tone all business. It was easier for her this way, Izuku realized. To treat him as a project, not a person. One for All was a biological phenomenon, passed down through DNA. A living entity in many ways. What you have now is what May and I have designated as AOFA, artificial One for All. May's enthusiasm surged back to the forefront. It's my greatest baby ever, she chirped, manipulating the hologram with a flick of her wrist. The original OFA stockpiled power over generations. My AOFA is a self-sustaining energy generator, but it's designed to mimic that function. Every time you use it, every time you push its limits, the core's regulator recalibrates to allow for a higher peak output. It learns. It grows stronger with use, just like the original. No more passing the torch, no more embers, just pure, sustainable power. Izuku stared at the glowing core in the diagram. It was a marvel, he knew that. But it felt like a blasphemy. And the other quirks? He asked, his voice flat. Black Whip? Float? Danger Sense? May zoomed in on a different part of the schematic, showing data streams running from the core to his limbs and sensory processors. Those were trickier. We analyzed every scrap of data we had on you in action, every fight, every training exercise. We broke them down and rebuilt them from the ground up as combat subroutines. Think of them as software packages that your central processor can run. Blackwhip.exe, Alyssa clarified. Float.dll, smokescreen.rtf. They're hard-coded into your system. They can be patched, updated, even improved. But they aren't the same. They are programs imitating quirks, not the real thing. A cold dread, a simulated emotion his processors flagged as anxiety_fear_cascade, began to build within him. He already knew the answer to his next question, but he had to ask it. He had to hear them say it. The vestiges, he said, his synthesized voice barely a whisper. Nana Shimura. Yoichi. Can I still talk to them? The room fell silent. All Might closed his eyes, his face etched with pain. Melissa looked down at her data slate, unable to meet his gaze. They were a part of the biological quirk, Izuku, she said softly. Echoes of consciousness stored within the energy and the DNA. They passed on with you. Their quirk factors were programs we could replicate. Their souls were not. The words hit him with the force of a physical blow, even though he couldn't feel it. There was just a sudden, sharp spike in his internal temperature, and a series of error warnings flashing in the periphery of his vision. The vestiges were gone. His mentors, his guides, the silent family that had lived inside him, they were gone. He had always known he was the ninth holder, a link in a sacred chain. Now, he was just a machine with a good memory. The chain was broken. He was alone. Utterly and completely alone with this cold, artificial power. The training facility was called the Crucible. It was a colossal, cavernous space deep in the bowels of Ireland, a playground of reinforced concrete, steel plating, and holographic projectors designed to simulate any combat scenario. Izuku stood in the center of the vast, empty room, wearing a simple black bodysuit. Melissa and May watched from a reinforced observation deck, their voices piped in through his audio receptors. Okay, Midoriya, Melissa's voice echoed in his head. Let's start slow. Try to access AOFA. Just a small percentage. Let's say 5%. He closed his eyes, a useless, learned gesture. He reached inside himself, searching for that familiar, warm surge of power, the feeling of a coiled spring of energy ready to be unleashed. There was nothing. He searched again, desperately. No warmth. No chorus of whispers from the vestiges. Just the cool, silent hum of his own internal systems. Don't think of it like flexing a muscle anymore. May's voice cut in, analytical and direct. It's a system command. Will it authorize the power release from your core? A system command? He focused, not on a feeling, but on an intention. A cold, logical directive. Authorize AOFA. Power output, 5%. Route to right arm. The change was instantaneous and jarring. A heads-up display flickered to life in his vision, something he hadn't known was there. Green lines of code scrolled past, and a power gauge appeared in the bottom right corner, jumping from 0% to a solid 5%. Data overlays highlighted the stress points on his arm's internal chassis, and a real-time temperature reading of his knuckles began to climb. There was no surge of power, no feeling of strength. There was only a notification. AOFA online. He looked at his right arm. It didn't glow. There was no dramatic crackle of green lightning. Instead, faint, hair-thin lines of emerald light traced the seams of his arm, like a living circuit board. It was clean. Efficient. Soulless. Target ahead, Melissa instructed. A 10-foot-thick wall of reinforced concrete slid out from the floor 50 feet in front of him. He fell into a familiar stance, the muscle memory perfectly preserved. He took a step, but his foot made no sound. His movement was unnervingly silent, the whir of his servos too high-pitched for normal human hearing. He drew his arm back. Detroit. Smash! His fist connected with the concrete. The result was just as devastating as he remembered. The wall didn't just crack, it exploded. A concussive boom echoed through the chamber as a storm of pulverized concrete and rebar shrapnel flew past him. A perfect, clean hole was punched straight through the center, but Izuku felt nothing. No bone-jarring recoil. No satisfying thump of impact traveling up his arm. No familiar, terrifying ache that warned him he was pushing his limits. His internal logs simply reported, impact detected. Kinetic energy dispersed, 98.7%. Structural integrity of arm, 100%. Minor temperature spike in knuckle actuators. Recommend monitoring. He stood there, arms still extended, staring at the destruction he had wrought. He was more powerful than ever, his form perfect and unbreakable. And he had never felt so disconnected, so utterly empty. Incredible! May's voice was giddy with triumph. Zero energy feedback. Perfect execution. Now, try one of the subroutines. Let's see. Black Whip, he focused again. Run subroutine, blackwhip.exe. The command executed. From the back of his hand and forearm, emitters glowed, and black tendrils erupted into existence. But they weren't the wild, chaotic ribbons of dark energy he was used to. These were constructs of hard light, perfectly formed and humming with a low, electric thrum. They moved with unnatural precision, responding to his thoughts like a mouse cursor on a screen. He willed one to extend and wrap around a steel girder high on the ceiling. It did so silently and with flawless accuracy. He pulled. His feet lifted from the ground, his body ascending with smooth, mechanical grace. He tested the others. Float was no longer a gentle, buoyant feeling. It was a targeted manipulation of graviton emitters in his feet, allowing him to hover with the stability of a drone. Danger sense wasn't a spike of adrenaline at the base of his skull. It was a dedicated sensory program that highlighted potential threats in his HUD with a red tactical overlay, analyzing trajectories and predicting attack vectors. He was a weapon. A perfect, efficient, beautiful weapon. And the boy who had dreamed of being a hero, the one who cried for others and broke his own body to save them, was nowhere to be found. Later that night, he sat in the darkness of his charging station. The tests had continued for hours. He had performed every task flawlessly, shattered every record, exceeded every expectation. Melissa and May were ecstatic. All Might had watched with a pained, forced smile. Now, the silence returned. And with it the ghost. He brought up a memory file. A perfect, high-definition recording from his own brain. The day he and Achiko had sat on a park bench after a particularly hard training session. The sun had been warm on his skin. He remembered the feeling of the rough wood of the bench, the sound of her laughter, the way the breeze felt as it rustled his hair. He could see it all, hear it all, but the sensations were just echoes, ghosts of a life he could no longer touch. A pressure began to build behind his optical sensors. An emotion he recognized with perfect clarity, grief. It was a tidal wave of loss for the boy he had been, for the friends he couldn't connect with, for the mother he could never truly hug again. The pain of his own death, which he hadn't had time to process, now crashed down on him. The loss of the vestiges. The cold, empty prison of his new body. The emotional response was overwhelming. His core temperature began to rise, and warning indicators flooded his vision. Emotional simulator overload. Recommend system purge. He needed a release. He needed to cry. He squeezed his eyes shut, focusing all his will, all his grief, on that single, simple human act. He wanted the hot sting of tears, the shuddering sob, the physical release that would lance the wound in his soul. Nothing happened. His face remained impassive. His optical sensors were perfectly dry. His vocalizer remained silent. He had no tear ducts. He had no lungs to heave with sobs. His perfectly engineered body had no system for expressing this profound, soul-crushing sorrow. He was a ghost weeping inside a machine that could not shed a tear. The realization broke him. It was a system crash, a blue screen of existential death. He didn't move. He didn't think. He simply stopped. He sat motionless on the edge of the alcove, his head bowed, his hands resting limply on his knees. The green light in his eyes dimmed to a bare flicker. He was a statue of a boy, frozen in an attitude of despair. He didn't know how long he sat there. Hours, perhaps. The door to his room slid open with a soft hiss. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. His audio sensors identified the familiar, labored breathing and shuffling footsteps. All Might stood in the doorway, his skeletal frame silhouetted against the hallway light. He looked at the unmoving figure of his successor, and his already broken heart fractured anew. "Young Midoriya?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Izuku, talk to me." Izuku's head slowly lifted. The green glow in his eyes was unsteady, flickering like a dying ember. When he spoke, the perfect modulation of his vocalizer was gone, replaced by a slight digital static, the sound of a system under unbearable strain. "They told me, my brain is still mostly biological," he said, the words coming slowly, as if dredged up from a great depth. "It's housed in this chassis. It sends the signals. The desire to move my hand, the memory of your face. The feeling of sadness." He looked down at his still hands. "All the signals are there, All Might. Right now, every neuron that is supposed to trigger a grief response is firing. My diagnostic says I am experiencing extreme emotional distress. But it gets lost in the wiring. It reaches my limbs as a command to remain still. It reaches my eyes and finds no tear ducts to activate. It reaches my vocalizer and is translated into this." He gestured vaguely at himself. "This calm. This quiet." He finally looked up, and for the first time, All Might saw the true, terrifying extent of the boy's prison. He saw a soul screaming from behind a pane of unbreakable glass. "I am in here," Izuku whispered, the static growing worse. "I feel everything. But my body, this thing, it won't let me show it. It won't let me be human." He paused, the silence stretching for an eternity. The faint hum of his core was the only sound. "All Might?" he asked, and the digital distortion in his voice sounded agonizingly like a sob he could not shed. "Am I still me? Or am I just your backup copy?" The question was a shard of ice in Toshinori Yagi's heart. He looked at the boy, the machine, and saw not a technological marvel, but the devastating cost of their ambition. He saw a soul trapped in a cage of his own making. "You are Izuku Midoriya," All Might said, his voice raw with a conviction he desperately needed to be true. He crossed the room and did what he had done countless times before. He placed a hand on his successor's shoulder. The contact was jarring. Instead of the familiar feel of fabric and warm muscle, his hand rested on a cool, unyielding surface that hummed with a barely perceptible vibration. Izuku's glowing eyes flickered up to meet his. "Your biosignature indicates severe emotional distress, All Might. My presence is a logical cause. Perhaps I should enter standby mode to prevent further." "No," Toshinori interrupted, his grip tightening. "You listen to me, my boy. A body of steel, a heart of gold. That's what they used to say about me. It wasn't the muscle that made me a hero. It was the choice, the will. What's inside you right now, screaming to get out, that is you. That is Izuku Midoriya. It is not a copy. It is a soul. And we will find a way to let it shine through. I promise you. The words, though heartfelt, were a bandage on a gaping wound. Izuku's internal processors analyzed them for sincerity, truthfulness, and emotional impact. The sincerity was 98.7%. Yet, the logic remained inescapable. He was a ghost. But for all might's sake, he chose to believe. He made a conscious decision to override the despair cascading through his neural net. It was his first real choice in this new body, the choice to hope. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. I will try. That conversation was a turning point. Izuku began to actively participate in his own integration. He spent weeks with Melissa and May, learning the minutiae of his new form not as a prisoner studying his cell, but as a pilot learning his craft. He memorized every schematic, every power conduit, every line of code that governed his existence. If he couldn't feel his body, he would understand it on a level no human ever could. He learned to modulate his vocalizer to mimic inflection, to program micro-expressions into his facial actuators, to simulate a breathing pattern that was natural and calming to others. He was becoming a masterful actor, playing the role of himself. The Hero Public Safety Commission, however, was not content to let their multi-trillion yen investment sit idle. The world, 2 years after the war, was in a precarious state of peace. The great evil was gone, but in its place, 1,000 lesser evils had bloomed. A new generation of villains, disillusioned and anarchic, plagued the recovering cities. The surviving pro-heroes were stretched thin, exhausted and grappling with their own trauma. The world needed a symbol. Not just of peace, but of progress. Of a future that could overcome even death itself. They decided it was time to unveil Project Phoenix. The press conference was a global event, broadcast from a massive, state-of-the-art auditorium on an island. The room was a sea of camera flashes, a cacophony of reporters from every major news outlet on the planet shouting questions. The atmosphere was electric with a mixture of morbid curiosity and feverish anticipation. The HPSC had announced the return of a fallen hero, a miracle of modern science. Rumors had swirled for days, ranging from a newly discovered healing quirk to cloning. No one was prepared for the truth. Backstage, Izuku stood perfectly still, his posture straight, his hands clasped behind his back. He was wearing a newly designed hero costume. It was a darker shade of green, almost forest green, with black and red accents. The material was a nanofiber weave that could harden for impact or flow like cloth. The iconic cowl was gone, replaced by a high-tech comms unit that cupped his ear. He looked older, sharper, more formidable. He looked like a soldier. Are you ready? Melissa asked, her voice tight with anxiety as she adjusted a final seam on his suit. My systems are operating at 100% efficiency, Izuku replied, his voice a calm, practiced baritone. It was the voice of a hero. The voice he had designed. That's not what I asked, she said softly, looking up into his glowing green eyes. He paused his simulated breathing for a fraction of a second. No, he answered, with perfect honesty. But the mission parameters are clear. The president of the HPSC, a stern woman named Chio Kurosaki, strode onto the stage to a thunderous wave of flashes and noise. She delivered a prepared speech about loss, sacrifice, and the indomitable spirit of heroism. She spoke of the war, of the hero who gave his life to end it, and of the miracle that would now lead them into the future. Ladies and gentlemen, she concluded, her voice ringing with authority. 2 years ago, he gave us his life. Today, science and the unquenchable human spirit have given him back to us. I present to you, the biosynthetic hero, the symbol of the future. Deku. The massive screen behind her lit up with his name as 2 sleek, armored doors slid open. Izuku walked out onto the stage. For a full 10 seconds, there was absolute, stunned silence. The hundreds of reporters in the room simply stared, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. It was him. It was unmistakably Deku, the hero who had died on every news channel 2 years ago. He looked just as he did in the old footage, only healthier, stronger, and wrong. There was a subtle perfection to him, an uncanny smoothness to his movements, a faint, otherworldly glow in his eyes that set every human instinct on edge. Then the dam broke. The room erupted into a frenzy of shouting and flashing lights so intense that his optical sensors had to automatically adjust the aperture to avoid being overloaded. He walked to the podium, his steps silent and measured. He looked out at the sea of faces, his internal software running facial recognition and emotional analysis on hundreds of people simultaneously. He registered awe, confusion, fear, and in some, outright disgust. He raised a hand, and the room, surprisingly, fell quiet. 2 years ago, he began, his voice amplified throughout the auditorium and across the globe. I made a choice. The choice to protect the people I cared about, no matter the cost. Today, I am here to tell you that the cost was not the end. It was a new beginning. He kept his speech brief, expertly crafted by the HPSC's PR team. He spoke of hope, of moving forward, of a new era of heroism where technology and humanity worked hand in hand. He didn't lie. He simply omitted the terrifying, isolating truth of his own existence. He was a perfect symbol, and a symbol couldn't afford to have a soul-crushing identity crisis. The questions came like machine gun fire. Are you really him? Do you have his memories? Is that a quirk, or is it technology? Can you feel pain? Can you die again? What does it mean for society if heroes can be manufactured? Are you a man, or are you a weapon? He answered each question with calm, calculated precision, feeding them the pre-approved, reassuring lines. But with every answer, he could feel the shift in the room. The initial awe was being replaced by something colder. Unease. Fear. The ethical and philosophical nightmare of his existence was dawning on them, and he was the living embodiment of it. He was a miracle to some, an abomination to others. In a darkened apartment in downtown Tokyo, a man watched the broadcast on a flickering, outdated CRT television. The room was a mess of wires, dismantled electronics, and anti-technology manifestos scrawled on the walls. The man, who called himself Analog, stroked a long, thin beard, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. He was a relic, a man who believed in the purity of the flesh and the sanctity of the quirk. He saw technology not as a tool for progress, but as a crutch, a poison that weakened humanity's natural evolution. Support items, communication networks, advanced medicine, he saw them all as abominations that made people soft, dependent, and unnatural. And now, he was looking at the ultimate blasphemy. A dead hero, resurrected not by the grace of a quirk, but by the hubris of science. A man replaced by a machine, wearing his face, stealing his name, a soulless puppet held up as a symbol of hope. They spit on his grave. Analog whispered, his knuckles turning white as he clenched his fist. They parade his corpse and call it a miracle. He looked at the followers gathered around him in the dim light. Disenfranchised individuals with powerful quirks who felt ostracized by a society that relied more and more on support gear and technology to keep them in check. They were the purifiers. They saw the truth in his words. Analog pointed a trembling finger at the screen, where Deku was calmly deflecting another probing question. That is not a hero, he snarled, his voice rising to a fervent sermon. That is a symptom of the disease. A cage of metal pretending to have a soul. It is the final insult to the natural order. We will not let this stand. We will show the world the folly of their ways. We will pull the plug on this technological nightmare. We will purify this world, starting with their false idol. His followers roared in approval, their quirks flaring in the darkness, a chorus of raw, untamed power ready to be unleashed. The reunion was not held at a party, or a public event. The HPSC arranged a private meeting at a secure facility for Deku and his closest friends from UA High, now some of the top pro heroes in Japan. It was meant to be a controlled, positive PR moment. It was, instead, excruciating. The first to arrive was Shoto Todoroki. He had grown into his power, carrying himself with a quiet, powerful confidence. His hair was a little longer, and the scar over his eye seemed less a mark of pain and more a part of his stoic identity. He stopped a few feet from Izuku, his heterochromatic eyes scanning him from head to toe. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a deep, penetrating analysis. Izuku's own sensors analyzed Shoto in turn, heart rate slightly elevated, body temperature normal, pupils dilated with curiosity. Shoto stepped forward and placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder, the same place All Might had touched. He activated his quirk. A thin layer of frost instantly bloomed across Izuku's suit, his internal temperature gauge dropping a few degrees before his regulatory systems compensated. Then, a soft wave of warmth followed as Shoto switched to his fire, the frost sublimating into steam. "Your body's temperature regulation is impressive," Shoto stated, his voice the same calm, even tone it had always been. He removed his hand. "When I heard, I wasn't sure what to expect. I am still processing it myself," Izuku replied, using the slightly warmer, more open vocal modulation he had programmed for friendly interactions. Shoto looked him directly in the eyes, searching for something beyond the green glow. "When you died, you threw yourself into the fire to save us. Your body may be different now, but when I look at you, I can see that same fire is still there. Your resolve is the same. That is what matters." Of all the reactions, Shoto's was the most accepting. He saw the core of the person, not the shell. A flicker of something that felt like gratitude, emotional response, +gratitude_0.8, warmed Izuku's thorium core by a fraction of a degree. The next arrival shattered that fragile moment of connection. Tenya Ida entered the room with his usual brisk, formal stride, but his movements were stiff, his expression deeply conflicted. As the head of a hero family that valued legacy, tradition, and the letter of the law, Izuku's very existence was an ethical minefield. "Midoriya-kun," Ida said, bowing sharply from the waist. It was the greeting one gave a superior officer, not a dear friend. "It is a relief to see you functional once more." Functional. The word hung in the air between them. Ida saw a machine that had been repaired. "It is good to see you too, Ida-kun," Izuku said, trying to project warmth he could not feel. Ida stayed a respectable 10 feet away, his hands clasped rigidly behind his back. He spoke of the current state of hero society, of the challenges his agency was facing, of the statistical increase in villain activity. He spoke of everything except what was standing right in front of him. He was avoiding the human, or inhuman, element entirely. He was treating Izuku like a colleague, a new piece of equipment the HPSC had deployed. The easy camaraderie they had once shared, the bond forged in the crucible of the UE dorms, was gone, replaced by a chasm of protocol and unease. Izuku understood. Ida's entire worldview was built on rules, order, and precedent. There was no precedent for a dead friend being rebuilt as a government-sanctioned android. To Ida, he was a paradox, and the only way he could cope was to keep a safe, professional distance. The interaction was a failure. Social interaction log, Ida, Tenya. Result, suboptimal. Recommend recalibration of friendship protocols. The thought was so cold, so alien, that it startled him. He was trying to debug his friendship. The door opened one last time, and Izuku's audio sensors picked up the sound of approaching footsteps he could have identified anywhere. They were heavy, aggressive, and utterly unmistakable. Katsuki Bakugo stood in the doorway. He was taller, broader, his jaw set in a permanent, defiant scowl. His hero costume was scarred and battle-worn, a testament to 2 years of relentless fighting at the absolute top of the hero rankings. He was no longer just a rival. He was a pillar of the hero world, and his crimson eyes were blazing with an emotion that Izuku's analyzers couldn't immediately quantify. It was a maelstrom of rage, grief, and profound, utter confusion. He stalked into the room, ignoring Todoroki and Ida completely. He stopped directly in front of Izuku, so close that Izuku could have counted the individual pores on his skin, if he'd had them. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken history. Bakugo's chest rose and fell with ragged, angry breaths. "You died," Bakugo finally growled, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "I saw you. We all saw you. You turned into goddamn dust and blew away." He jabbed a finger hard into Izuku's chest. The finger met unyielding metal beneath the nanofiber suit. The contact made a dull thump. "So you tell me," Bakugo snarled, his face contorting into a mask of fury. "What gives this thing, the right to wear your face?" Without another word he drew back his fist. There was no warning, no explosive crackle of his quirk. It was a raw, purely physical blow, fueled by 2 years of repressed grief and rage. His fist connected with Izuku's jaw with brutal force. The sound was not the wet, sickening crunch of fist meeting bone. It was a loud, metallic clang, the sound of a wrench striking an anvil. It echoed in the silent room. Izuku's head barely moved an inch. His internal dampeners absorbed the kinetic energy instantly. His diagnostics flashed a notification. Minor external impact detected. No damage. He remained perfectly still, his glowing green eyes fixed on Bakugo. Bakugo, however, was not unharmed. He staggered back, clutching his hand, a string of curses hissing through his clenched teeth. He stared at his own bruised, possibly broken knuckles, then back at Izuku's impassive, perfect face. The fury in his eyes slowly dissolved, replaced by a look of dawning horror and a pain that had nothing to do with his injured hand. He hadn't just punched a person. He had punched a wall. A machine. And in that moment, the unbridgeable gulf between the Deku he had known and the thing standing before him became terrifyingly real. The ghost in the machine was hidden deeper than he could ever reach with his fists. The metallic clang of Bakugo's fist against Izuku's jaw echoed the deafening silence that followed. Todoroki tensed, a shimmer of frost forming on his right hand. Ida took a sharp, scandalized step forward, his arm chopping the air in a motion of aborted reprimand. But it was the look on Bakugo's face that froze them all. The rage had evaporated, leaving behind a raw, bewildering pain. He was staring at his bruised knuckles as if they belonged to a stranger, then back at Izuku's perfectly unmarked face, the disconnect short-circuiting his entire being. Izuku's processors worked at lightning speed, analyzing the event. Aggressor, Bakugo, Katsuki. Action, physical assault. Motivation, grief-induced rage, existential confusion. Damage to unit 0%. Damage to aggressor, superficial tissue damage, probable metacarpal fractures. His programming offered a dozen tactical responses, from incapacitating Bakugo to delivering a calming, de-escalating speech. He chose none of them. Instead, he accessed his memory files of every interaction he had ever had with his childhood friend. He saw the bullying, the rivalry, the grudging respect, the desperate battle they had fought side by side. He understood, in a way his cold logic couldn't fully parse, that this was not an attack. It was a question. "Are you still in there?" His vocalizer remained silent. He simply stood there, letting Bakugo confront the hard, metallic truth of what he had become. Bakugo finally tore his gaze away, a strangled, guttural sound catching in his throat. He shoved past Todoroki and Ida and stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard the frame shuddered. The reunion was over. It was an unmitigated disaster. In the aftermath, the HPSC went into damage control. They assigned Izuku a liaison officer for his initial patrols, someone who could help him reintegrate into the field and provide a sense of stability. The choice was logical, practical, and in a way, deeply ironic. They assigned him Hero Ingenium, Tenya Ida. Their first patrol together was a study in professional awkwardness. They moved through the gleaming, high-tech Shiodome district of Tokyo, a landscape of towering glass skyscrapers and automated public transport. It was a fitting environment for Izuku's redebut, a city of the future, patrolled by the hero of the future. Ida marched with his characteristic, ramrod-straight posture, his polished armor gleaming. He maintained a precise, 3-foot distance from Izuku at all times. He communicated in clipped, formal reports, pointing out surveillance blind spots and potential security risks. The crime rate in this sector has decreased by 12% since the installation of the Sky Eye drone system, Ida reported, gesturing to a barely visible drone hovering near the top of a skyscraper. However, response times for subterranean incidents remained suboptimal. Acknowledged. Izuku replied, his own optical sensors already networked with the city's surveillance grid. He could see through the Sky Eye's cameras, access public transit schedules, and monitor the power grid all at once. His consciousness was spread across the district, a silent, digital guardian angel. He was a perfect hero for this new age. The experience was profoundly isolating. He walked among the citizens, a ghost in their midst. People would stop and stare, their conversations dying as he passed. Some would point, whispering excitedly. Others would hurry their children along, their faces tight with fear. They didn't see a hero, they saw a spectacle. A walking, talking piece of bleeding-edge technology that wore a dead boy's face. He could hear their heartbeats quicken as he approached, a symphony of public unease. Do not let their reactions trouble you, Midori-kun, Ida said stiffly, noticing his pause. Public perception is a fluctuating variable. Consistency in one's duty is the only true constant. Izuku almost told him that he couldn't be troubled, that his emotional simulators were running at baseline levels. But he knew it would only widen the gulf between them. You are right, Ida-kun. Duty is the priority. The call came in just after noon. A silent alarm from the Chuamitsui Trust Bank, 3 blocks east. Multiple armed assailants, hostages reported. Let's go! Ida commanded, his leg engines flaring to life with a familiar roar. He shot down the street like a blue and silver bullet. Izuku's response was silent and instantaneous. He didn't need engines. He simply routed 15% of AOFA's power to his legs and pushed off. He accelerated from a standstill to over 100 miles per hour in a fraction of a second, a silent green blur that easily outpaced Ida. He arrived at the bank a full 10 seconds before his partner, landing soundlessly on the pavement outside. His sensors immediately went to work. X-ray and thermal imaging scanned the building, painting a clear picture of the situation inside. 5 hostiles, armed with heavy projectile weapons, 12 hostages, huddled in the center of the main lobby. And something else. Each of the hostiles had a device strapped to their back, emitting a strange, pulsing energy signature that his systems couldn't immediately identify. Ida skidded to a halt beside him a moment later. What's the situation? He panted, his engines whining as they cooled. 5 hostiles, 12 hostages, Izuku reported calmly, his eyes glowing as he processed the data. They are equipped with some kind of energy pack. The signature is unstable. I recommend a swift, non-lethal breach to minimize. He was cut off as the bank's heavy front doors were blasted off their hinges from the inside. A man in a grotesque kabuki mask stepped out, laughing. He was holding a strange, rifle-like device, its barrel crackling with blue energy. Look what we have here! Ingenium! The villain crowed. And the ghost! The walking appliance! Perfect! We came here for cash, but a field test on the HPSC's new toy is a much better prize. Before Ida could respond, the man raised his weapon and fired. It didn't shoot a bullet or a beam of light. It unleashed a wave of shimmering, invisible energy. Izuku's danger sense subroutine screamed. A dozen red alerts flooded his HUD. Warning: high-energy electromagnetic pulse detected. Immediate evasive maneuvers recommended. He moved, shoving Ida out of the blast radius with a precisely calculated push. The wave of energy washed over him, and for the first time since his awakening, his perfect, flawless body failed. The world dissolved into a nightmare of digital snow. His audio receptors screeched with a piercing blast of static. His vision fractured into 1,000 glitching pixels, the image of the bank lobby stuttering and tearing. The data streams from the city grid, the constant flow of information that had become his sixth sense, were severed. He was cut off, deaf and blind. Critical system error, EMP attack, ocular sensors, malfunctioning, audio sensors, malfunctioning, AOFA power core, output dropped to 30%, combat subroutines, offline. He stumbled, his perfect gyroscopic balance failing him. He was no longer a state-of-the-art hero. He was a deaf, blind machine with a fraction of its power, staggering in the middle of a street. He had weaknesses he had never even conceived of. He was more vulnerable now than he had ever been in his fragile, human body. What's wrong with him? He heard Ida yell, the sound distorted and broken through the static. Told you! He's just a machine! The villain shrieked with glee. And we know how to break machines! Another EMP blast washed over him. This one was stronger. His motor controls began to spasm. His left leg locked up, and he fell to one knee with a heavy, metallic thud. The green glow in his eyes flickered violently, like a dying light bulb. He could feel, not physically, but as a cascade of error reports, his internal systems shutting down one by one to prevent a total cascade failure. He was helpless. A barrage of gunfire erupted from the bank. The other villains had joined the fray. Ida, seeing Izuku was down, moved instantly. He became a shield, his armor sparking as bullets ricocheted off him. He used his speed to become a whirlwind of motion, disarming 2 of the shooters before they could get a clear shot at the hostages still inside. "Deku! Get up! I need backup!" Ida shouted, his voice laced with a genuine panic Izuku had never heard from him before. Izuku's mind, the biological part of him, raced. His body was failing, his high-tech senses useless. He couldn't rely on the machine. He had to rely on himself. On the instincts honed over years of battle. He couldn't see, but he could remember. He had the building's layout memorized. He knew the villains' positions from his initial scan. "Think like a machine," May's voice echoed in his memory. No, that was wrong. The machine had failed. He had to think like a hero who commanded a machine. Reboot, his mind screamed at his own systems. Force a system reboot. Divert all remaining power to core processing and motor control. He sent the command, a desperate surge of will. His vision went completely black for a full 2 seconds. The static in his ears stopped. For a terrifying moment, there was nothing. Then, a single line of green text appeared in the darkness. Emergency reboot sequence initiated. Are rerouting power from non-essential systems. Sensory suites offline. AOFA core stabilized at 28%. Motor control online. His vision was still gone, but he could move. He pushed himself to his feet, his body feeling sluggish and heavy. He was blind, but not deaf. He could hear the fight. The crack of gunfire. Ida's engines. The villain's taunts. Analyze the EMP frequency. He commanded his internal systems. Develop a countermeasure. Reroute power from thermal regulation to create a localized EM shield. It was a gamble. He would be diverting power from his own cooling systems. If he used AOFA, he risked overheating his core and causing a meltdown. But it was the only option. A stream of data flowed through his mind. His processors, working on emergency power, analyzed the residual energy from the blast. Frequency identified. Shielding protocol Aegis developed. Power diversion requires manual override. Warning, core temperature will become critical after 120 seconds of AOFA usage. Override accepted. He subvocalized. He felt a subtle shift as power was rerouted. A new icon appeared on his defunct HUD, a shield currently inactive. He still couldn't see, but he could calculate. He triangulated the position of the lead villain based on the sound of his voice and laughter. Trajectory, distance, velocity. The numbers flowed through his mind with perfect, cold clarity. He couldn't get close. He had to use a ranged attack. Delaware smash. He raised his arm, flicking his finger with a motion he had practiced 1,000,000 times. He poured a mere 8% of his remaining power into the attack. A small, focused cannon of air shot silently from his fingertip. It was no longer an instinctual blast of power. It was a precisely calculated projectile. The villain who had been laughing suddenly choked, his EMP rifle flying from his hands as he was thrown backward into the bank's lobby. "He can still fight!" one of the others yelled. "Hit him again!" Another EMP wave washed over him. This time, Izuku was ready. He activated the Aegis protocol. A faint shimmer, invisible to the naked eye, flickered around his body for a fraction of a second. The wave hit the shield and dissipated. His systems held. His motor control was unaffected. He was blind, but he was back in the fight. He began to move, a silent, deadly predator. He used sound and his own perfect memory of the battlefield to track his opponents. He fired off one calculated Delaware smash after another, each one perfectly aimed to disarm or incapacitate. The villains, accustomed to fighting heroes they could see and hear coming, were completely unprepared for a silent, blind opponent who moved with inhuman precision. Ida, for his part, saw the tide turn. He saw Deku, standing amidst the chaos, his eyes dark and lifeless, yet moving with a terrifying purpose. He redoubled his own efforts, using reciprocal bursts to secure the last of the hostages and subdue the villains Izuku had disoriented. Within 90 seconds it was over. All 5 villains were unconscious, tangled in a heap. The hostages were safe. Ida stood panting, his armor dented and smoking. Izuku stood perfectly still, his head cocked as if listening to a distant sound. A wisp of steam began to rise from the seams in his armor, as his core temperature climbed into the red. Warning, core temperature critical. Immediate shutdown required. He sent the command to vent the excess heat. Panels on his back and shoulders hissed open, releasing a cloud of superheated vapor into the air. He felt his systems begin to stabilize. The fight was won. But the victory felt hollow. He had been taken down by a single, unexpected piece of technology. He had been forced to rely on his partner to protect him. He had exposed a critical, previously unknown weakness. Sirens wailed in the distance. Police and other pro-heroes were arriving. And with them came the press. And another hero. A familiar series of explosions propelled the figure through the air. Katsuki Bakugo, in his full hero dynamite gear, landed with a heavy thud, his gauntlets smoking. He took in the scene at a glance. The subdued villains, the terrified hostages, Ida looking exhausted, and Izuku standing silently amidst a cloud of steam. Bakugo's eyes narrowed, zeroing in on Izuku. He saw the lifeless eyes, the rigid posture. He saw a machine that had just finished a task, not a person who had just survived a fight. He stomped over, his face a thunderous mask of rage. It wasn't the confused, hurt anger from their last meeting. This was something else. This was fury. What the hell was that? Bakugo snarled, jabbing a thumb towards the EMP rifle lying on the ground. That piece of junk took you down? You, with all your fancy new parts? Izuku's vocalizer came back online. It was an unforeseen weakness. My systems were unprepared for a directed electromagnetic pulse of that magnitude. Unforeseen weakness? Systems? Bakugo mimicked his monotone, his voice dripping with contempt. You sound like a damn instruction manual. The old Deku, the useless, quirkless Deku, would have found a way to fight. He wouldn't have just stood there and glitched out like a broken toy. I adapted my strategy and neutralized the threat, Izuku stated, the lack of emotion in his voice only infuriating Bakugo more. You got lucky. Four Eyes here saved your shiny metal ass, Bakugo shouted, gesturing wildly at Ida. You died being a hero, you damn nerd. You sacrificed everything. And for what? So you could come back as this thing that can be taken out by a glorified toaster? You're a disgrace to your own memory. He grabbed Izuku by the collar of his suit, pulling him forward until their faces were inches apart. He was searching, desperately searching for a flicker of the old Izuku, a spark of defiance, a flash of anger. He found nothing, only the cold, empty green glow of two LED lights set in a perfect, impassive face. The confrontation was a stark, brutal reversal of their entire history. For years, Izuku had been the one chasing after Bakugo, trying to prove himself. Now Bakugo was the one screaming at a silent, unmoving wall, desperately trying to provoke a reaction from a rival who was no longer there. He was yelling at a ghost. Letting go as if he'd been burned, Bakugo took a step back. The fury drained out of him, replaced by a profound, hollow look. He glanced at Ida, at the approaching police cars, and then one last time at the silent, steaming android that wore his friend's face. Without another word, he turned and blasted himself into the sky, leaving behind a trail of smoke and a silence more damning than any explosion. The confrontation with Bakugo was logged, analyzed, and filed away in Izuku's memory banks. Social interaction log, Bakugo, Katsuki. Result, catastrophic failure. Conclusion, current behavioral algorithms ineffective for highly emotional, historically complex relationships. The cold, clinical summary was a stark contrast to the phantom ache that resonated within his neural net. It was the ghost of a feeling, a simulated echo of the hurt and frustration that the old Izuku would have felt. He had failed to connect, failed to be recognized. He had proven Bakugo's point. He was a thing, not a person. The HPSC, after reviewing the incident report, particularly the part about his EMP vulnerability, recalled him to Island for immediate upgrades. He spent a week in the lab with Melissa and May, a conscious, passive observer to his own dissection. They installed new electromagnetic shielding, upgraded his sensory suite's firmware, and ran hundreds of simulations to identify other potential weaknesses. Throughout the process, he was the perfect subject, silent, compliant, and utterly detached. He was a problem to be solved, and he assisted in his own debugging. But as they worked on his hardware, his own internal processors were occupied with a different problem. He kept replaying his interactions. With Ida's professional distance, with Todoroki's analytical acceptance, with Bakugo's furious, grief-stricken rejection. He saw a pattern. They were all reacting to the shell, to the machine. They couldn't see the ghost inside. And then his thoughts turned to the two people whose perception of him mattered more than anyone's. His mother. And Achiko Uraraka. He had been avoiding them. The HPSC had suggested it, framing it as a kindness to allow them more time to adjust. But Izuku knew the real reason. He was afraid. It was an illogical, irrational fear that his emotion simulators couldn't quite quantify. Fear of their rejection? Fear of causing them more pain? Or was it the fear of seeing himself through their eyes and confirming, once and for all, that the boy they loved was truly gone? He decided he could not delay any longer. If he was to be anything more than a weapon, if he was to honor the memories he carried, he had to face his past. He had to go home. He requested a supervised, off-duty leave from the commission. Reluctantly, they agreed. The apartment building was old, modest, and achingly familiar. His optical sensors recognized the exact shade of beige paint on the walls, the specific pattern of cracks in the pavement he had hopped over as a child. His audio sensors picked up the familiar sounds of the neighborhood, the distant rumble of the train, the laughter of children in a nearby park, the chirping of sparrows. He had perfect, high-fidelity recordings of all these things in his memory. But standing there, experiencing them through his new senses, it was like watching a movie of his own life. The emotional resonance was missing. He stood before apartment 405. The nameplate on the door simply read, Midoriya. He raised his hand to knock, the motion smooth and silent. He paused for 1.7 seconds, running a final diagnostic on his social interaction protocols. He had programmed a subroutine specifically for this meeting, designed to mimic his old mannerisms, to soften the clinical edge of his voice. He was as ready as he could be. He knocked. The sound was a gentle, polite rap on the wood. He heard a shuffling sound from within, the clink of a chain lock, and then the door creaked open. Inko Midoriya looked smaller than he remembered. The past 2 years had been cruel to her. Grief had carved new lines onto her face, and her perpetually worried expression had deepened into one of profound, weary sadness. Her hair had more gray in it than his memory files indicated. She was holding a dish towel, and her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she had been crying recently. She peered out, expecting a delivery or a neighbor. Her eyes widened slightly, then narrowed in confusion. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. He was taller, his posture unnaturally perfect, his new hero costume unfamiliar. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft and tired. "Mom," Izuku said. He had modulated his voice to be as gentle as possible, a near-perfect replication of his teenage self. But the word, spoken without breath, without the warmth of a human chest, was still fundamentally wrong. Inko's face went slack with shock. The dish towel slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. Her hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes, those large, green eyes so like his own, filled with a mixture of disbelief, terror, and a desperate, heartbreaking flicker of hope. "Izuku?" she whispered, the name a fragile, broken thing. "No, it can't be. I saw, on the news, it's me, Mom," he said, forcing his facial actuators into a gentle, reassuring smile. It felt like a mask. "I'm back." She stared at him, her entire body trembling. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she saw the faint, unnatural green glow. She saw the too-perfect skin, the utter stillness of his posture. The hope in her eyes died, replaced by a wave of confusion and fear. This was her son, but it wasn't. It was a phantom wearing his face, but she was his mother. And that instinct, deeper and more powerful than any fear, took over. With a choked sob, she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "Oh, Izuku! My baby! My sweet boy!" She hugged him with all the strength in her body, a desperate, clinging embrace. And Izuku stood there, his arms frozen at his sides. His sensors registered everything with perfect, excruciating clarity. The pressure of her arms around his torso. The exact temperature of her body. the saline content of the tears soaking into the fabric of his suit. He could hear the frantic, irregular beating of her heart against his silent, unmoving chest. He knew what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to hug her back. He was supposed to hold her, comfort her, cry with her. He sent the command to his arms. Lift. Embrace. Replicate comforting gesture. His arms moved, wrapping around her small frame in a smooth, mechanical motion. He was holding her. But there was no warmth in his touch. No gentle give of muscle. He was cold, hard, and unyielding as a statue. Inko felt it instantly. She stiffened, her sobs catching in her throat. The comforting embrace she sought was met with the unbending reality of metal and polymer. It was like hugging a lamppost. Slowly she pulled back, her hands still resting on his chest. Her expression was one of profound bewilderment. "You're so cold," she whispered, her hand tracing the seam of his suit. "My internal temperature is regulated at a constant 37 degrees Celsius for optimal system performance," he explained, the words coming out before his social subroutine could stop them. It was a factual statement, an attempt to explain, but it was the most inhuman thing he could have said. Inko flinched as if he'd struck her. She took a step back, pulling her hands away. "Come in," she said, her voice strained, turning away so he couldn't see the fresh wave of tears in her eyes. "Come in, you'll catch a cold." The old, meaningless motherly phrase was a desperate grasp for normalcy in a situation that was anything but. The apartment was exactly as he remembered it. Every All Might poster was still on his bedroom wall. Every piece of mismatched furniture was in its proper place. The air smelled of green tea and old paper. It was a shrine to a life that no longer existed. They sat at the small kitchen table in an agonizing silence. Inko kept looking at him, then looking away, her mind clearly struggling to reconcile the boy in her memory with the being in front of her. "Are you hungry?" she asked suddenly, her face lighting up with a desperate need to do something, anything, normal. "Of course you are. You must be starving. I'll make you katsudon. Your favorite." Before he could respond, she was on her feet, bustling around the tiny kitchen. She pulled a pan from a cupboard, rice from the pantry, pork from the refrigerator. The familiar, comforting sounds of her cooking filled the apartment. It was the soundtrack of his childhood. Izuku watched her, his processors flagging a high probability of a severe social protocol failure. He should have stopped her immediately. But watching her move with such purpose, such desperate, maternal love, he couldn't bring himself to do it. He allowed the charade to continue for her sake. The smell of cooking pork and sweet onions soon filled the air. His olfactory sensors identified every compound, every spice. He accessed his memory file of the taste, a perfect, vivid recollection. He knew exactly what it was supposed to taste like. Finally, she placed the steaming, perfect bowl of katsudon in front of him. Her face was flushed from the stove, and for the first time since he had arrived, she was smiling. A real, genuine smile. "There," she said, her voice full of warmth. "Eat up. You're too thin." He looked down at the bowl. The steam rose, carrying the scent he had loved his entire life. Then he looked at his mother's hopeful, expectant face. The lie had to end. "Mom," he said gently. "I can't," her smile faltered. "What? Is it not right? I might be a little out of practice." "No, it's not that. It looks perfect," he said. "My body, this new body, doesn't require sustenance. I am powered by an internal core. I don't have a digestive system." The words fell into the room with the weight of lead. Inko stared at him, then at the bowl of katsudon she had poured all her love and hope into. The smile vanished completely, replaced by an expression of utter devastation. She sank back into her chair, her shoulders slumping. "Oh," she whispered. I forgot." She hadn't forgotten. She had been trying to deny it. The pain in her eyes was a physical thing. He felt a surge of something. A diagnostic alert. His emotional simulator was flashing red, flagging his own response as regret_guilt_failure. He needed to fix this, to comfort her. He reached across the table, intending to take her hand. He had practiced this. A gentle pressure, a simulation of warmth by increasing the surface temperature of his fingertips. But she flinched, pulling her hand away before he could touch her. The rejection was absolute. He was a source of pain, a cold, unlovable thing that could only remind her of what she had lost. "My return has caused you significant emotional distress," he stated, his voice defaulting to its clinical baseline. The social subroutine had crashed. "Logically, it may have been a mistake for me to come here. I apologize." That was the final blow. He wasn't her son, comforting her. He was a machine, analyzing a problem and offering an apology for a failed experiment. Inko finally broke. She didn't scream or yell. She just started to cry. Silent, heartbroken tears streamed down her face as she stared at the ghost of her son, a perfect stranger sitting at her kitchen table. The meeting with Achiko Uraraka was, if possible, even worse. She had requested to meet him on neutral ground. They chose a small, quiet park overlooking the ocean, a place they had visited once or twice during their UA days. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. It was a beautiful, romantic setting, and it made the cold chasm between them feel all the more vast. She was waiting for him on a bench. She looked incredible. Her pro-hero costume, a sleek, updated version of her original design, suited her. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that spoke of 2 years of hard-won battles and experience. But as he approached, he saw the nervousness in her eyes, the way she was twisting her hands in her lap. "Deku-kun," she said, her voice soft. "Uraraka-san," he replied, stopping a few feet from the bench. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." "Of course," she said, managing a small, shaky smile. I had to see you." An awkward silence fell between them. His social protocols suggested several conversation starters, all of them feeling hollow and artificial. He opted for observation. "You have been successful," he said, gesturing vaguely. "Your agency, your ranking. I have followed your career. You have saved many people. I am proud of the hero you have become." The word proud was a string of code, a selected emotional descriptor. It had no depth. She seemed to notice. "Thank you," she said, her gaze dropping to the ground. "We all just tried to keep going. Tried to be the heroes you would have wanted us to be." There it was. The ghost. She was talking to the boy who died, not the man, the thing, in front of her. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "Can I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She raised a hesitant hand. He knew what she was asking. He gave a slight nod. She stepped forward and slowly, gently, reached out to touch his cheek. Her fingers were warm and soft. His thermal sensors registered the exact temperature. His pressure sensors logged the light contact. But the feeling, the electric jolt of her touch that he remembered so vividly, was gone. He was a stone. He did not flinch, did not react, did not even breathe. Her hand trembled against his face. She was touching skin, but it felt like marble. She looked into his eyes, searching for the boy she had known, the shy, determined, kind-hearted Izuku she had. "I grieved for you," she said, her voice cracking, her hand falling back to her side. "For 2 years I grieved for you, Izuku. I went to your grave. I talked to you. I learned to live with the fact that you were gone. And then, they turned on the TV. And you were just there. And I don't know what to feel." He processed her words. Subject, Uraraka Achiko. Emotional state, confusion, grief, anxiety. Cause, subject's unexpected reappearance. His programming dictated that the logical course of action was to clarify the situation and alleviate her distress. "My analysis indicates that my return has caused a logical paradox in your grieving process, creating significant emotional distress," he began, his voice taking on the tone of a diagnostic report. "From a psychological standpoint, this is a predictable outcome. I apologize for the instability my reactivation has introduced into your life." He thought he was helping. He was explaining her own feelings to her, offering a logical framework for her pain. He could not have been more wrong. Achiko stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. That clinical, detached analysis wasn't an explanation. It was an insult. It was the final confirmation that the boy she knew, the one with the boundless heart and the empathetic soul, was gone. In his place was this machine, analyzing her pain like a data point. "Is that all it is to you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a hurt so deep it made him flag a new critical error in his systems. "Data? An analysis? Do you feel anything at all?" He couldn't lie to her. "I can access my memories of emotion. My programming can emulate a response. But no, Uraraka-san. I cannot feel. Not in the way you do." That was it. That was the end. The fragile hope she had been clinging to shattered into a million pieces. She took a step back, then another, shaking her head. The kind, determined hero who could face down any villain looked utterly defeated. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though it wasn't clear who she was apologizing to. I can't do this." She turned and walked away, her shoulders slumped. She didn't run. She just walked away, leaving him standing alone as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into twilight. He watched her go, a perfect, silent statue. His core temperature was stable. His systems were nominal. And inside the flawless, unbreakable machine, the ghost of Izuku Midoriya had never felt more broken. The weeks following Izuku's disastrous personal reunions were a sterile blur of calculated duty. He threw himself into the work of being a hero with a singular, machine-like focus, because it was the only thing he had left. He was no longer Izuku Midoriya, son, friend, or anything else. He was Hero Deku, Asset 7G, a biosynthetic peacekeeper deployed by the Hero Public Safety Commission. This new identity was a shield, a firewall to protect the ghost in his machine from the pain of what he had lost. He was ruthlessly efficient. He would patrol for 20 hours a day, entering a 2-hour diagnostic and recharge cycle before beginning again. He didn't need sleep, food, or rest. He responded to incidents with a speed and precision that was terrifying to both villains and civilians. He would stop a bank robbery by calculating the exact trajectory to ricochet a single Air Force flick off 3 walls to disarm all the assailants simultaneously. He would rescue civilians from a burning building by running thermal scans to locate them, and then carving a path through the flames, his own body impervious to the heat. He was a perfect hero. And people were starting to fear him. They didn't cheer when he arrived. They fell silent. They watched with wide, unnerved eyes as this perfect, silent being descended from the sky, neutralized the threat without a wasted motion or a single word, and then vanished as quickly as he had appeared. He was not their protector. He was a force of nature, an inhuman solution to a human problem. The media dubbed him the Ghost Hero, a name that was more accurate than they could ever know. All Might watched this transformation with a growing sense of dread. The boy whose heart had been too big for his body was now a hero whose body had no room for a heart. He was slipping away, burying himself under layers of code and protocol. Toshinori tried to reach him, to talk to him, but it was like talking to a sophisticated customer service AI. Izuku would listen politely, analyze his concerns, and assure him that all systems were operating within expected parameters. He was a walking, talking press release for his own existence. Meanwhile, in the grimy, shadowed corners of the city, the purifiers were preparing to make their move. Their leader, Analog, saw Deku's public reception not as a failure, but as a validation of his entire philosophy. Society was instinctively rejecting the technological idol the HPSC had foisted upon them. The time was right to stoke that fear, to turn unease into outright panic. He needed a stage, a symbol to tear down to prove his point. And he found the perfect one. The annual HeroCon and Support Item Expo, hosted by the Detonarat Company, was one of the biggest events in the hero world. It was a gleaming celebration of technology's role in heroism. Every major support company was there, showing off the latest in high-tensile armor, communication systems, and capture weapons. It was a temple dedicated to the very ideology Analog despised. This year, its keynote speaker and star attraction was the ultimate fusion of hero and technology, Deku. The convention center was a sprawling complex of glass and steel, packed with thousands of heroes, support staff, and enthusiastic fans. Izuku stood on the main stage, a colossal screen behind him displaying a rotating 3D model of his own internal schematics. He delivered a speech, written by a team of PR experts, about synergy, progress, and the boundless potential of the future. His delivery was flawless, his tone inspiring, his gestures perfectly timed. It was a masterpiece of public speaking. And it was utterly hollow. He could see the faces in the crowd. Some were enraptured, particularly the younger generation who saw him as the pinnacle of evolution. But he also saw the veterans, the older heroes whose bodies were roadmaps of scars and old injuries. They watched him with a mixture of professional curiosity and deep-seated mistrust. They saw a hero who had never known the sting of a pulled muscle, the agony of a broken bone, the terror of true, physical vulnerability. They saw a shortcut they had never been offered. As his speech concluded to a wave of polite, if not entirely enthusiastic, applause, the lights in the massive hall suddenly flickered and died. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Emergency lights, powered by independent generators, kicked on a second later, casting the hall in a dim, eerie red glow. Then, every screen in the building, from the colossal jumbotron behind the stage to the tiny smartphones in every person's hand, flickered to life. They did not show the convention logo. They showed a man in a simple, dark robe, his face obscured by a blank, white mask that had no features save for two pinprick eye holes. It was Analog, Heroes of Japan. The figure began, his voice electronically distorted, yet carrying a charismatic, sermon-like cadence. Citizens of a world gone astray. Look around you. You stand in a temple of falsehoods, a monument to the crutches you have allowed to replace your own strength. On the screen, the view switched to live footage from within the convention center. Panic was beginning to set in as people realized the doors were sealed and communications were jammed. For generations, Analog's voice boomed. The quirk was our evolution. Our gift. A sacred biological truth. It was meant to make us stronger, to test our limits, to forge us in the crucible of real danger. But you grew afraid. You traded the purity of your own power for the hollow comfort of these trinkets. The screen showed images of famous support items. Bakugo's gauntlets, Ida's engines, Aizawa's goggles. You have allowed technology to poison the wellspring of human potential. You have become reliant on armor, on computers, on gadgets that fight your battles for you. You have forgotten the strength that lies in your own flesh and blood. You have become weak. Unnatural. Izuku stood frozen on the stage, his internal systems immediately trying to trace the signal. But it was being bounced through a dozen encrypted proxies. This was a professional, coordinated attack. Then, Analog's faceless mask seemed to turn, to look directly at him. And now, you have your new god. The ultimate blasphemy. A machine built in the image of a dead hero. A soulless copy, a puppet of the state, held up as your symbol of hope. The screen behind Analog switched to a live feed of Izuku, standing alone on the stage, bathed in the red emergency lights. They tell you this is progress. I tell you it is a perversion. A mockery of the very idea of a hero's sacrifice. It is a technological cancer that promises a future where humanity is obsolete, replaced by its own creations. Suddenly, explosions rocked the convention center from multiple points. The sound wasn't of bombs, but of walls being breached by raw, physical force. Through the dust and debris, figures began to pour into the hall. They were the purifiers. Each one wore a simple, uniform-like outfit, but they were armed with nothing but their own quirks. A man whose skin could turn to stone, a woman who could generate concussive blasts from her hands, a beast-like man with razor-sharp claws. There were dozens of them, and their eyes burned with a fanatical light. Tonight, we purify this temple. Analog's voice roared. We will tear down these false idols and remind you what true power looks like. No gadgets. No tricks. Only the flesh and the will. The attack began. The purifiers swarmed the floor, but they weren't targeting civilians. They were systematically destroying the exhibition booths, tearing apart the support items with a feral glee. The pro-heroes in attendance, caught off guard, moved to engage. Izuku's mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Threat level, critical. Multiple hostiles. Civilian evacuation priority 1. His comms were dead. He was cut off. He looked out at the chaos and saw Bakugo, who had been in the VIP section, already blasting his way toward a group of purifiers, his face a mask of pure rage. He saw Shoto Todoroki creating walls of ice, forming barriers to protect fleeing civilians. He was about to leap from the stage when a new figure emerged from the smoke directly in front of him. It was Analog. In person, he was tall and wiry, and he moved with a strange, unnerving grace. He held no weapon. "The ghost hero," Analog said, his voice now clear and undistorted, a calm, resonant baritone. He tilted his masked head. "Do you know why they call you that? Because they can feel it. They can feel the emptiness inside you. You wear a hero's face, but you have none of his light. Evacuate the civilians and surrender," Izuku said, his voice a flat, commanding tone. He shifted into a combat stance. "You have made a grave miscalculation," Analog laughed, a soft, pitying sound. "The only miscalculation was made by your creators. They thought they could replicate a soul with wires and code." He didn't attack. He just stood there, watching Izuku. "Go on then," he goaded. "Show me the power of technology. Show me the ghost of one for all." Izuku didn't waste any more time on words. He surged forward, his silent feet carrying him across the stage in a nanosecond. He drew back his fist for a controlled, 15% smash, aimed to incapacitate, not obliterate. As his fist flew, Analog simply raised a hand. His masked face was pointed directly at Izuku. And then it happened. The world glitched. It was like the EMP attack, but infinitely worse. It wasn't a sudden blast of static. It was a slow, agonizing corruption of his systems. The heads-up display in his vision began to fill with corrupted code, letters and numbers melting into nonsensical symbols. The power gauge for AOFA flickered violently, jumping from 15% to 80%, then down to 3%, then back up again. His punch, which should have been a pinpoint strike, lost all its power, his arm feeling heavy and unresponsive. He stumbled to a halt, his fist stopping inches from Analog's chest. "Warning! Warning! Unknown external influence detected. AOFA core regulator malfunctioning. All systems compromised." "What's the matter, machine?" Analog taunted, his voice calm and steady. "System crash?" Izuku tried to access his combat subroutines. Blackwhip.exe. The command was met with a string of error messages. He tried to activate float. His graviton emitters sparked and died. He was losing control of his own body. His limbs began to twitch, his joints locking and unlocking erratically. The green glow in his eyes flickered and changed color, flashing red, then blue, then yellow. "My quirk," Analog explained, as if lecturing a student, "is called Signal Scramble. A rather fitting name, don't you think? Any technology one can see, any system that relies on electrical signals. I can disrupt it. Corrupt it. Turn it into a useless pile of junk. And you, Deku, you are the most advanced pile of junk I have ever seen." Izuku fell to one knee, his head bowed as he fought a war within his own code. He was trying to build firewalls, to isolate his core programming, but Analog's influence was like a virus, spreading through every circuit. He could hear the sounds of the battle raging around him. He heard Bakugo roaring in frustration as he fought purifiers who were using quirk-enhancing drugs, making them unnaturally strong and durable. He heard Shoto calling for backup that would never come. His friends were fighting, bleeding, and he, the most powerful hero in the room, was on his knees, crippled by a single, perfectly suited quirk. "You see?" Analog said, stepping closer and looming over him. He gestured to the chaos in the hall. "This is the truth. Flesh and blood, will and spirit, fighting a real battle. And you are a liability, a broken tool. You are not the future. You are a dead end." He was right. In that moment, Izuku felt a surge of something his processors identified as despair. He was useless. Bakugo had been right. He was a disgrace to his own memory. A massive explosion rocked the stage. It wasn't one of the purifiers. It was Bakugo. He had blasted his way through two stone-skinned villains and was now standing between Izuku and Analog, his one good gauntlet smoking, his body bruised and bleeding, his face a mask of incandescent fury. "Get the hell away from him, you masked freak!" Bakugo roared. Analog simply looked at Bakugo's remaining gauntlet. Another crutch, he said dismissively. With a flick of his gaze, the gauntlet sputtered. The intricate machinery that regulated Bakugo's explosions sparked, hissed, and then died completely. Bakugo stared at his now useless support item in disbelief. No! Analog said, turning his attention back to Izuku. I want him to watch. I want the puppet to see what happens when the real heroes break. But Bakugo had never relied solely on his gear. With a feral scream, he lunged forward, his hands crackling with raw, unassisted explosions. This was the opening they needed. But Izuku couldn't move. He was still fighting his own systems. His vision was a kaleidoscope of corrupted data. He felt a hand grab the back of his suit. It was Bakugo. Get up, you useless goddamn toaster! He screamed, his voice strained. He was trying to fight and drag Izuku at the same time. I'm not letting you die again, you hear me? The words, the raw, desperate plea in his rival's voice, cut through the digital noise. It was a lifeline. A command that superseded any line of code. He needed help. Izuku focused all of his remaining processing power on a single directive: regain control. Any control. He managed to get his legs under him. He was still twitching, his systems in chaos, but he could stand. Bakugo was fighting a furious, losing battle, a one-man army against a wave of fanatics. Shoto was nearby, his ice walls cracking under the assault of a villain who could generate powerful vibrations. They were being overwhelmed. We have to retreat, Shoto yelled, creating a massive glacier to block a new wave of purifiers. We don't retreat! Bakugo screamed back, but he knew it was a lost cause. He grabbed Izuku again. Move, damn it! He half-dragged, half-carried Izuku's glitching, spasming body away from the stage, behind the cover of Shoto's ice. It was a humiliating, terrifying reversal of their entire dynamic. For years, Izuku had been the one to get himself into trouble, and Bakugo had been the one to angrily, reluctantly, bail him out. Now, Bakugo was risking everything to save the friend he could barely stand to look at, while that friend was reduced to a twitching, helpless machine. They managed to breach an outer wall and escape into the night, leaving the convention center in flames. The purifiers didn't pursue. They had achieved their goal. From the roof of the burning building, Analog watched them go. His sermon was complete. He had shown the world their technological savior, brought to his knees by a single, elegant truth. He had exposed the ghost in the machine for what he was, a fragile, flawed, and ultimately inferior imitation of a true hero. The seeds of fear and doubt had been sown, and they would reap a harvest of purification.